Good day and welcome to Varn Vlog. I am going to be talking about the minimal self and the atomized persona today. But first I have to address my own atomized persona. Varn Vlog started off as a way for me to pass the time when I took some time off of working with Doug Lane at Zero Books about a year and a half ago. Since then, a lot has changed. I've always had a complicated relationship with my surname. It's fairly unique. Its history is opaque. There are two sources of the name. One is a corruption of a Celtic name, and the other is a corruption of a Bulgarian city. And it's not even my family's original surname. It's a long, slow corruption of Varnado, which was the surname of a group of people of mixed origin, some of whom seem to have been Sephardic Jews who moved to the United States all the way back with the Dutch colonists, and they came through France. Their history is obscured. The name mutated over a long period of time. Both Varnado and Vidiao show up. They don't seem to have been directly related. Now, this little narcissistic journey through my family is actually because I have a very complicated relationship with my name. I always hated being called just my surname. I worked at a military school for a while, and I associated it with the police and with the military to just be called your surname. It was to remove you any individuality and to call you by your family, for which you are a representation. It's a pretty effective kind of depersonalization. When I lived in some other places where it was more common just to use surnames like that, particularly when I was in the Republic of Korea, I kind of dropped the hostility to my name, and Douglas Lane used to use it, despite the fact that I preferred to be called my middle name, Derek. Now, the complications with my surname is because I have a complicated relationship with my grandfather and my father. My grandfather was a key figure in my life. My father was, well, it's more complicated than that. And in the last week, they're both gone. Now, as my fans, you shouldn't really care, but it makes me wonder if I still want to call this Varn Vlog. Because in my line, there were only men with that name, Varn, and I am the last one, and I feel deeply ambivalent about it. Now that my father has died somewhat early at the age of 68, the name feels a little bit more ominous than it used to. I think I will keep it, but I'm not sure. Now, I'm not going to turn my own family history into a learning lesson about the changing societal norms, although my grandfather was a bricklayer and my father was a salesman. Neither were formally educated beyond high school. In fact, my grandfather was only formally educated to about 8th grade. His father died in the Depression, of what we now might call a death of despair. He was very young, and my grandfather raised his family and then married and then raised another family. Now, a lot of people don't realize how old I am, but these three Varns go back a century. More than that. If my grandfather was still alive, he would be almost 100 years old, I think. Within half decade of it. And it's hard for me because it doesn't feel like he's been gone for 20 years. Or 18 years. Anyway. And that's 6 minutes of my own reflection. I'm going to leave this in, even though part of me thinks I should cut it out. So I turned to a bunch of books that are considered in the questionable reading category for leftists. Lester McIntyre, Michael Sandel, and a few other books, actually. So, for example, Bong Chul Han, The Palliative Society, has been somewhat edifying as I have been processing my emotions for what I think's happened to my family and my culture. Do not get me wrong, my family was a Southern family, interracially intermixed for sure, but also on both sides, both the right and wrong side of history, and that the way that meaningless phrase goes, of almost every major debate in American life for the past 150, 200 years. And the other parts of my family came over later, and the waves of immigration after World War I. I have professors and dirt farmers in my history. And in that sense, and in the multi-ethnic sense, there is a way in which my life is a stereotypically American life, even if it is marked by the exceptionality of being able to travel, of being cultured, and in being able to learn multiple languages, at least to read. My speaking of them is somewhat limited, I will admit. So I turned to this book, The Minimal Self by Christopher Lasch, because I think it explained his project very well, but also because right now it speaks to me both culturally and politically, but also personally. Now, we always talk about the personal as political. We talk about political journeys, but all that narrativizing, if we are honest, for most people, is a kind of self-understanding exercise. Not even to say narcissistic. All people in all societies have understood themselves in the context of narratives, and the turn against grand narratives has itself been a narrative of which we understand ourselves. And in fact, I'm going to go into Raymond Tallis talking about some of the critiques of literary realism in another video, because the whole post-structural turn against the meta-narrative has itself been a meta-narrative, one that's predicated on a bunch of statements about exceptionalisms and periods of modernity, of which, no, Virginia, you aren't that special. Fragmentation, degeneration, stagnation are common themes in all history. And while the Whiggish way of saying, oh, the past was terrible and the current is just so much better, we should probably admit that at best, things are just differently uneven. And to understand that and to understand the systems which drove that is interesting. Anyway, That's 10 minutes of preamble on a video that I thought maybe would be 10 minutes, but I'm just going to go today. We're going to be reading from the introduction of The Minimal Self, Consumption, Narcissism, and Mass Culture. Materialism and Mass Culture. The denunciation of American materialism has a long history, but recently events have given it new urgency. The energy crisis, the American defeat in Vietnam, the hostage crisis, the loss of American markets to the West Germans and the Japanese have revived old misgivings about the links between cultural decadence and national failure. American know-how, it appears, no longer dominates the world. American technology is no longer the most advanced. The country's industrial plant is decrepit, and the streets and transport systems are falling to pieces. The question arises whether the faltering of American economy and the failure of American foreign policy do not reflect a deeper failure of morale, a cultural crisis associated in some way with the collapse of the traditional value and the emergence of a new morality of self-gratification. See, what's funny about that is this is about the 70s, the late 70s transition into the 1980s and the end of Fordism into what would later be identified as neoliberalism's ascension. But what is funny about right now is we actually can find parallels to all those developments. American tech dominance is becoming decrepit. We have the overaccumulation of tech. The industrial sector has long since fallen off, and our automation is no longer particularly impressive. Our ability to compete with the Japanese and West Germans have been more or less established. But now China, following a similar development pattern, although with more state control than Japan, has operated in a similar way, and that too seems to be winding down. Hegemons, however, can get nostalgic pretty easily, and one wonders if this is part of what's infecting Lasch's thinking here. But let's continue. In the right-wing version of this argument, governmental paternalism and secular humanism have sapped the moral foundations of American enterprise, while pacifism, survivalism, the movements for unilateral disarmament have emasculated the American foreign policy and made Americans unwilling to fight for freedom. Another version, more acceptable to liberals and neoconservatives, stresses the bad effects of consumerism. In July 1979, President Carter attributed the national malaise to the spirit of self-seeking, the pursuit of things. The conventional critique of narcissism, as we might call it, equates narcissism with selfishness and treats consumerism as a kind of moral lapse that can be corrected by the exhortations about values of hard work and family life. It deplores the breakdown of work discipline and the popularization of fun morality that has allegedly crippled productivity, undermined the American enterprise, and thus weakened the country's competitive position in the race for markets and national greatness. And again, we hear this echoed in both conservative and even in some social democratic forms in American life. Now, I want to point out that it was in this malaise in which I was born. I was born in 1980, just before Reagan actually assumed office. My family had deteriorated, and my mother was working as a waitress after not getting the education she had been offered because of parental intervention. That decided that a woman didn't need an education at Georgia Tech in I believe that was in the late 60s. And so her entire next few years was as a wife. And then when my father left her with me in tow, she began working as a waitress. And it was in that world that I was born. Still's very different from today, but also very similar. I don't remember it, of course. The early 80s are a blur for me. My first memories come around 1985. And while I do remember both the Reagan administration and the wind up to the Cold War somewhat vividly, actually. They were still just memories in an otherwise congenial but and many times impoverished childhood. Until my mother remarried, we were often unstable, and I stayed with grandparents or in cars. Extended family was forced upon me, but also I loved it. Not gonna lie. Even though I had a rough childhood, my time with my extended family, in even ones of them who were not good people, particularly honestly, was often some of the best times of that time. I think about that when I read this book, about that world in which I was born into, because it seems so far from us today, and yet it rhymes with now. And in fact, I've been commenting about how American stagnation has seemed to rhyme with the late 70s since the end of the Bush administration. It's almost as if we didn't have another metaphor to go to. But also, it's not like it at all. The Cold War is long gone. People barely remember it. If anything, they fight it now for nostalgic reasons and the ability to have a clear, ideological hero story, one that is fundamentally not applicable to the current situation. As the unipolar world moves to a bipolar but universally declining one in terms of capital production and wealth, you're going to see a lot of this. And its decline will be facilitated by both the climate crisis and by other systemic limits. The excess of the 1990s or even the 1950s was never possible forever. I don't say this as a degrowther or someone who's saying that the time of development is over or any of that. I'm just telling you this as a fact. The world is changing, and it always does. Whether or not this is the final crisis of capitalism is yet to be seen, and will probably always yet to be seen if we are honest with ourselves, since every Marxist that has predicted that since Marx himself in 1850 has been wrong. Nonetheless, here we are. But often what they are right about is the end of a period of capitalism and the end of a style of organizing nation states. And in these time periods, it does seem like a free-for-all. What is interesting about this is the psychic effect of the individual. We talk about the individual's relationship to the collective, but what has this shift in self meant from the end of the Fordist period to the neoliberal one? Because there is a continuity there, as I pointed out before. How does it affect you as a person? In which ways is your self-construction socially constrained? Not just by the biology and your sensuous physical being, but also by the limits of which you have been foisted into and the world of which has been foisted upon you. After all, you are a product of it. Your agency is limited by it, and the context of your choices emerge from it. Let's continue. A third position that have words immediately in reply to the critique of narcissism. A number of journalists and social critics, Daniel Yankovich, Peter Celiak, Paul Wattel, Alvin Toffler, Theodore Roslak, Philip Slater, and Marlon Ferguson, among others, a bunch of names that I have never encountered outside of this book, I will also add, have begun to argue that the apparent increase in self-absorption is only a byproduct of more encouraging cultural change. They dismiss the idea of a national malaise or a crisis of confidence. Industrial society may be sick in their view, but it is already giving way to a post-industrial society that will consolidate the achievements of industrialism on a new basis. This is the dominant narrative that went out, folks. Critics of consumerism, they argue, miss the movement away from competitive status seeking towards self-sufficiency, exploration and personal growth, and non-materialistic forms of self-fulfillment. Those who take this hopeful view of recent cultural changes disagree amongst themselves about the difficulty of the transition ahead and about the nature of the society which it is leading. The only thing that justifies treating them as a group is all of them reject the diagnosis that our society is as narcissistic. As Jankovic put it, American quest for self-fulfillment cannot be reduced to pathology of narcissistic personality disorders. Narcissism, this is in quotations, is not the essence of the recent American search for self-fulfillment. This is also in quotations. Far beyond it being definitive characteristics, narcissism is a betrayal of it. The controversy about narcissism, which revives in a new from earlier controversies about mass culture and American national character, raises an important question and helps call to attention the connections between the social and economic changes and the changes in personal and cultural life. For one thing, the concept of narcissism remains elusive and obscure, even though it appears eminently accessible. Those who object to the description of advanced industrial culture as a culture of narcissism do not understand very clearly what the description implies, while those who accept it all too quickly accept it as a journalistic slogan that merely restates the moralistic platitudes in the jargon of psychoanalysis. Hey, using the jargon as therapy to hide moral and political positions is totally a tradition of American life and probably Western life in general. Sorry. Anyway, get back to this. Narcissism is a difficult idea that looks easy, a good recipe for confusion. Another source of confusion is the persistence of certain perceptions derived from a controversy that divided critics of mass culture in the 50s and 60s from celebrants of cultural democracy and pluralism. Recent attempts to reformulate this debate to salvage what is useful in the critique of mass culture by detaching it from the ill-conceived defense of cultural modernism have been misunderstood as attempts to revive earlier positions in their original form. I have suggested elsewhere that the phenomenon of mass culture, too often treated from the point of view of its impact on aesthetic standards, raises to questions about technology, not about the level of public taste. Listen to this is important because we're living through a similar transition now that often gets cast as an aesthetic problem. It's not. Advanced technologies of communication, which seem merely to facilitate the dissemination of information on a wider scale than was possible before, prove on a closer examination to impede the circulation of ideas and to concentrate control over information in a handful of giant organizations, which, by the way, is still true. It's just different now because the way that giant organizations facilitate the control over information seems more ribosomic. You seem to have more input over it when you're on Twitter or Facebook, but you're all going through Twitter or Facebook, aren't you? And it really does control Google, Microsoft, what can be said and shared, even though it gives you the illusion of not just being a consumer, but also a producer of said content. What we see is a change in this tendency, but not its end. The end of mass consumerism of television didn't really stop until the 1990s or maybe even the early aughts. But the current development into something else that we see now of social media really only figured out how to get monetized under conditions of cheap debt in the teens, and thus it expanded massively. But it also increased control of social media over a lot of media life. And the right-wing complaints about this have been true, as have liberals using it in their pull in the tech culture and the fear of regulation as a threat, even if it would violate certain American standards as the First Amendment, to lead to even more control over information. And frankly, most of the critics of these tech companies have proposals that would even increase it more, just lead to an even more proactive censorship of everything. removing the protection clauses from the Communications Act of the 90s would definitely do that. And that has been a right-wing proposition that some left-wingers have been, some left liberals have been okay with. Nonetheless, what many people have nostalgia for of the sanity of mass culture is the sanity of the cultural control being explicit as opposed to right now where it is implicit. And the fact that monetization and the degeneration of the value of a lot of social media in terms of its usefulness to people's lives and its positivity, because negative engagement increases engagement with ads, as every news corporation learned in the fucking 70s, is something that really has changed the nature of social media itself. But it follows a pattern going all the way back to the 1960s. I will continue. The study of mass culture that leads to the same conclusions are prompted by the study of mechanization of the workplace, that the most advanced technology embodies by design in both senses of the word is a one-way system of management and communications. Well, now it's a two-way system, but it's still just as much management and still just held by a small group of people. It concentrates economic and political control and increasingly cultural control as well in a small elite of corporate planners, market analysts, and social engineers. That's still true. It invites popular input or feedback only in the form of suggestion market surveys, and popular opinion polls. That's no longer true. Technology has come to serve as an effective instrument of social control in case of mass media by short-circuiting the electoral process through opinion surveys that help shape the opinion instead of merely recording it. You don't believe me? Look at the way survey bias works. I use polls all the time because of the best information that we have, but I'm aware of their limitations. Notice when I talked about the in a video where I talk about the difference between the acceptance of capitalism versus the decline in popularity of socialism, where both declined, well, no other options were on hand. Or when I talk about media and I talk about the fairness doctrine was fair by limiting what counted as legitimate oppositional opinions. Right? It is true that it really did set the limits of public opinion in a way that the 19th century did not. And in some ways, our current environment actually weirdly resembles both environments in which we have massive corporate control over the means of communication, but we have highly partisan and derisive newspapers and whatnot because no one has the money to operate properly functioning newsrooms, and the focus is all on the national level anyway, which ironically leads to the reemergence of partisan presses across the board, because why else would you engage in press? To engage in the press means you have an agenda, because to have a profit motive means that it is a stupid investment. Technology that comes to serve as an effective instrument of social control, in the case of mass media, by short-circuiting the electoral process through opinion surveys that help shape opinion instead of merely recording it, by reserving the media themselves to the right to select political leaders and spokesmen. Don't believe it, and it has perverse effects. Look at what happened with Trump. The media focused on Trump, gave him tons of free advertising. And by presenting the choice of leaders and parties as a choice among consumer goods. Notice that the civic delineation of politics, the small politics, has gone away, and you really are left with two identity brands, the conservative one and the liberal one, and most of the Western polities. That's a real trend that started way before social media, right? Blaming it on social media as a scapegoat. The interpretation of mass culture and of vast technology may be wrong, but it is a different argument from the old accusation that mass culture lowers the public taste, or from the Marxist version of this accusation, according to which mass culture merely brainwashes the workers and keeps them in a state of false consciousness. Yet the terms of the earlier debate remain so coercive that the new arguments are immediately assimilated to the old ones. Criticism of the narcissistic elements in our culture strike many observers as a lament for the morally tuned, well-crafted self, in the words of Peter Selleck. It is not my position, however, as Herbert Gans tries to summarize it, that if the commercial popular culture was eliminated, workers could and would become intellectuals. Why would workers become intellectuals? I find it hard to imagine a less attractive prospect than a society made up entirely of intellectuals. What is important is that the working man and woman have more control over their work. It is also important for intellectuals and workers alike to see that the question of control is not just a political or an economic question, but a cultural question as well. I'm going to read one more section and then I'm going to stop. And I've been debriefing as we read it. Hopefully, you can tell the passage apart. I will put the citation in the show notes for you. Mass production and mass consumption. Still another source of confusion in recent controversies about contemporary culture is a failure to distinguish a moralistic indictment of consumerism, typified by Carter's complaint about the obsession with owning things, consuming things, from the analysis that understands mass consumption as part of a larger pattern of dependence, disorientation, and loss of control. Instead of thinking of consumption as the antithesis of labor, as if the two activities call for completely different mental and emotional qualities, we need to see them as two sides of the same process. Duh! But anyway, the social arrangements that support a system of mass production and mass consumption to discourage initiative and self-reliance and promote dependence, passivity, and a spectatorial state of mind both at work and at play. Consumerism is the other side of the degradation of work, the elimination of playfulness and craftsmanship from the process of production. In the United States, consumer culture began to emerge in the 1920s, but only after the corporate transformation of industry and the industrialized, the division of labor that runs through all modern industrial society, the division between brain work and manual labor, between design and the execution of production really developed. Under the banner of scientific management, capitalists expropriated the technological knowledge formerly exercised by workers, reformulated it as science, and vested its control in a new managerial elite. The managers extended their power not only at the expense of the owners of industry, as is so often said, but at the expense of the workers. Nor did the eventual triumph of industrial unionism break the pattern of managerial control. By the 1930s, even the most militant unions had acquiesced in the division of labor between planning and execution of work. Indeed, the very success of the union movement was predicated on a strategic retreat from issues of worker control. And that is true in Europe, too, by the way. For those of you who go, but Europe didn't. Yes, it did. On this, it's just whether or not it was a Fordist model or a social democratic model. If the planners were part of the state, or if the planners and managerial apparatus were part of the corporate firm. Unionization, moreover, helped stabilize and rationalize the labor market and to discipline the workforce, something that I've talked about all the time. It did not alter the arrangement whereby management controls the technology of production, the rhythm of work, and the location of plants, even when those decisions affect whole communities, leaving the worker with the task of merely carrying out the orders. With better pay sometimes. It's very, like, not having a union in those conditions is worse than being in one, but the union was part of this, and this has to be understood as why unionization became unpopular in the 1970s and 80s. Having organized mass production on the basis of a new division of labor, mostly fully realizing the assembly line, the leaders of American industry turned to the organization of mass market. The mobilization of American consumer demand, together with the recruitment of the labor force, required a far-reaching series of cultural changes. People had to be discouraged from providing their own wants and re-socialize as consumers. Does this not strike you as true? How dependent on you are on other technologies for things that people could basically do amongst themselves, and how dependent on you on services for things that people used to do in the household? Now, admittedly, we shouldn't romanticize that. The household was full of servants and all kinds of highly exploitative arrangements, both within the family and in the larger home economy. But nonetheless, we didn't get rid of that. We just commodified it. People had to be discouraged from providing their own wants and re-socialized as consumers. Industrialization, by its very nature, tends to discourage home production and make people dependent on the market. And the vast effort of re-education, starting in the 1920s, which had to be taken before Americans accepted consumption as a way of life. As Emma Rothschild has shown in her study of the automobile industry, Alfred Sloan's Innovations in Marketing, the annual model of change, constantly upgrading the product, the efforts of associating it with social status, the deliberate inclination of a boundless appetite for change, constituted a necessary counterpart to Henry Ford's innovations of production. Modern industry came to rest on the twin pillars of Fordism and Sloanism. Both tended to discourage enterprise and independent thinking and to make individuals distrust their own judgment, even in matters of taste. His current untutored preferences, it appeared, might lag behind current fashion. They too needed to be periodically upgraded. And we see this in the social consumption and cultural capital and social capital patterns we see today. Now, I'm not saying everything Lasch says here is perfectly and exactly true, but it definitely fits the broader patterns that lead up to now. And I read it because, again, I was born into the world in which this was dying and the current world was born, but the difference between those worlds is overstated. There are elements of our current society that were predicted as early as 1905 about tubes and atomization. There's certain works that go into this in early science fiction by British authors that saw some of the trends we see now, the declining attention span, etc. And we always dismiss this as just cultural grumpiness or Victorian fastidiousness, but there are trends in which people were watching. It's not always been so opaque. And whether one is Jean Baudrillard in his more obsequious moments or Raymond Tallis, who always complained about Baudrillard as post-Caesarean theoria, we can see they were actually similar observations they were making about the trajectory of this kind of thinking and its implications in our culture and economy. The only way out is to understand that and not to parcel it or to pretend that your project is just limited by the fact we don't have Medicare for all or something like this. Not only have American socialists been under-ambitious, they've been under-analytical and not really addressed the long array of the cultural problems at hand, and often taken liberal explanations for it, often an excuse for the period that this book is talking about as the kind of high point of American culture as given. My friends, it's time to grow up. I hope you get something out of this. It comes from a sincere place. I'll be doing more readings like this and as well as other explainers as we go on here. The show is changing. I said I was going to record less. That hasn't actually been true. What I'm recording is differently. I know it doesn't seem that way, but I can make like 10 of these videos in the time it makes me to do 2 good interview videos. Now, yes, if I had better production standards and whatnot, it would take longer, but you're coming here to listen to me. The visual aspect is just a result of the medium. I highly doubt most of you want to see my shining face every day. All right. Take care. Be strong. Cultivate yourself. Be cynical about systems. Be weary of people who sell you easy systems. And be weary of those who are so misanthropic as to believe that they have a whole lot to say while just shitting on other people. But don't buy the poptimism. Don't buy the optimism. Don't buy people who tell you that what you're experiencing is not real and that we are just building better and better towards a Steven Pinker-like better tomorrow. Don't buy it. It's not true. It's not even wrong.